Hi, my name's Cameron Jacobus. My topic was about race and racism in Brazil and kind of comparing that with race and racism here in the United States. Our group's kind of overall theme was about race, and the other group members kind of chose to focus on um, protest, protesting aspects and police brutality, but I didn't really get into that very much. I just kind of got into racism, and then the prejudices that black people in Brazil and the United States face. Um, so to kind of start out, Brazil was the only Portuguese colony in South America, so that made it like a little bit different than all the other Spanish and a couple French colonies that were there because there was just a huge need for slaves because Brazil produced the most sugar, the most coffee during that time period, so they needed more African slaves to work the plantations where those crops were grown, and also because of how close Brazil is to Africa. Like if you look at a map, it's really close, just barely separated by the Atlantic Ocean. Which is why like millions upon millions of African-born slaves were brought to Brazil, and more specifically the state of Salvador, which is the easternmost state in Brazil and the closest to Africa. Um, Now, kind of in the U.S., here it's really easy for us to define race because we kind of always have historically gone off of like the one drop rule, where if you have like one drop of African blood in you, that technically makes you black. Or at least that's how it historically always was. But in Brazil, it's always been kind of a gray area of who is black and who is not black, and that kind of makes it difficult to discern when these people are being discriminated against, because if you can't define who is black and who is not black, then how can you define when they are or are not being discriminated against based on their color? When the Brazilian government decided to take off racial categories from the official census and left it up to the people to define their own racial categories, they used over 100 different definitions of what color they were. To kind of go off that, one of my teachers is Brazilian, and I asked her like, "What color are you?" And she defined her own color as coffee with milk, which I kind of thought was interesting because I don't think you'd really ever hear somebody in the United States define themselves as coffee with milk. They just use I'm white, I'm black, or I'm mixed. There's not really any gray area, like you're black, you're white, kind of like that. But in Brazil, there's just so many different racial categories between white and black, European, African, that it's just really hard to define who is who and where that line can be drawn. Um, um, the Portuguese settlers in Brazil, um, they did things a little bit differently than the Spanish settlers because it was normal for them to have kids with their African slaves, whereas in other colonies it was kind of seen as taboo, and it wasn't necessarily seen as like a good thing. But the children that were born to these um, slaves and colonizers were born free, rather than in the Spanish and English colonies like here. They were born into slavery, and in Brazil they were born free people, which means they could kind of do what they want. And because of that, they were free to have kids with whoever they wanted, which is where that racial mixing really started to get blurred, because you'd have mixed people having children with people of all other different races, which kind of started to get things really looking like a rainbow. Um, and also, they were free to have children with indigenous people, which in the United States that really didn't happen, because indigenous people were also kind of seen as like a second class population. There wasn't really any racial mixing with the indigenous Native Americans, as there was in Brazil. And also, after slavery ended in Brazil in 1888, which was it was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to end slavery. There was no like official segregation. Like when slavery ended, black and white people were equal, or so they say. And that's kind of a point of pride for many Brazilians, that after slavery ended, their government did not officially endorse any sort of segregation. That's not to say that there wasn't segregation, but here in the United States we had Jim Crow laws. Like, black people can't sit on this part of the bus, they can't sit at this counter. But in Brazil you were theoretically equal. And one of Brazil's most famous sociologists, Gilberto Freire, said that Brazil doesn't have a race problem, it has a class problem. And by that he means that all of the social problems that black people are facing in Brazilian society can be traced back to what social class they come from. He kind of says that there are poor white, poor black, poor mixed, poor native peoples, poor people from all over the country that are suffering from these same problems that the poor blacks are, but he kind of fails to mention that a huge percentage of the poor population is black. So he kind of does a little bit of injustice to the problems that these people are facing. And a lot of people don't like to talk about race in Brazil because it's kind of seen as taboo. Like, the country isn't racist. That's the official stance, so people don't want to talk about it. So his definition of the country being classist rather than racist has actually kind of been widely accepted because of how taboo this subject actually is. And in the 19th century, right after slavery ended, there was a need for labor to work the plantations that the slaves had once owned, or that the slaves had once worked on. So the Brazilian government imported lots of European immigrants, like German and Italian people, to come work on these plantations as low-income laborers. And then the government kind of used this to their advantage as well, because they took on like an official stance of whitening. So they wanted to make the country seem more white and European, so they kind of incentivized the new settlers to have kids with the people that look more African, to try and make the population look more white, like Portugal, their former colonizer, and all the other European powers. They have a white image, and that's what Brazil wanted because they saw it as kind of having higher esteem. Another thing that we also have here is like the quality of education that black children receive in Brazil. It's lower because they live in lower income areas with worse schools. So again, going back to the issue of classism versus racism, you can say that it's because classism that they're not receiving the same education because they live in poorer areas of the country. But then again, they're black, and a majority of the poor population is black, so is it really classism? Is it really racism? It's a blurred line. But the poorer quality of education leads to them not being able to pass like the entrance exams to get into the free public universities, which are seen as kind of higher esteem than the private universities that you have to pay to get into. So then they're not gonna these kids aren't gonna be able to get a college degree. They're not gonna be able to get jobs that require a college degree. So it's kind of a vicious circle that you see. And it all starts with having worse fundamental education. Blacks in Brazil are worse off in terms of education, income, and life expectancy. Again, if you don't get a good education, you're probably not going to make as much money, and your quality of life isn't going to be as good, so your life expectancy is obviously going to go down. And they're also kind of interesting fact that people of African descent have an 18% higher infant mortality rate in Brazil than their white European counterparts, which I just kind of thought was interesting because there's really no scientific evidence of why that is happening, but it just kind of is 18% higher. And the way women are seen in Brazil, the black mixed race woman, they call them mulatas. They're seen as like hypersexualized, and they kind of, during the period of slavery, they were really blamed for a lot of the intermixing of races that occurred because like the European plantation owners couldn't resist them, so that's why there were so many offspring had with these former slaves. Brazil can also be called the laboratory of civilization because of all the racial mixing that has occurred there. It's like you don't see that anywhere else in the world. Blacks mixing with whites, mixing with Europeans, mixing with indigenous, all of those people mixing together, and then you just have those offspring mixing with everybody else. So it's really an interesting place because it's totally unique. and there's a documentary called Black in Latin America, Brazil, a racial democracy, where Henry Louis Gates Jr., black professor, goes to Brazil and kind of talks about blackness. And there's like 6 or 7 different guys, and they all say that they're black, but they all hold out their hands, and they're all different colors. So how can somebody be racist if they don't know what black is? Because in one setting you can be black, in one setting you can be white. So are you being discriminated against because you're black, or are you being discriminated against because you're poor? But when polled, 89% of the people in Brazil said that the country was racist, even though it's kind of seen as a country that's not racist. It just kind of goes to show that the image that they want the world to see is different than the image that the people see. But in the United States here, we use like a biracial system. So kind of like I said, you're black, you're white, or you're mixed. But there's really not anything in between. In Brazil, they use a multiracial system, which means that there's black, there's white, and there's literally every color combination between. And mixed people here in the United States are kind of seen as if they were black, but in Brazil, they're not. They're seen as their own whole different racial category, like mixed. But there's, like I said, over 100 different definitions of what mixed is. And then also in the United States, we suffered from like a phobia of black people after slavery ended. Like black men were kind of seen as hyperactive, dangerous. Brazil didn't really see that. They were just kind of seen as second-class citizens, not in the eyes of the government, but in the eyes of the individuals. And it just kind of, Brazil, it wants to be seen as a racial paradise where everybody's equal, but it's not. Blacks are discriminated against unfairly, and they say that it isn't racism, they say it's classism, but the two are pretty much the same because of the extremely high percentage of people that are poor but are black. So yes, it's a classist society, but in that classism is racism. So it's kind of it's racism wearing a mask of classism. But yeah, Brazilians use this classism to justify their racism because it's taboo to talk about race, so they use class instead. Yeah.